The void between galaxies was not meant to be crossed by human hands. Not yet. Not like this. The Milky Way was 2 billion light-years behind them, a smear of cold light lost somewhere in the impossible dark, and the USS Odyssey hung in the silence like a wounded animal, her hull groaning under stresses that her designers back at Area 51 had never anticipated and her crew had never trained to survive. Warning lights cascaded across every station on the bridge. The smell of burnt conduit and scorched titanium drifted through the ventilation system, sharp and acrid, the scent of a ship that had been pushed through something it was never meant to survive. Colonel Cameron Mitchell gripped the armrest of the command chair hard enough that his knuckles had gone white 20 minutes ago and hadn't recovered since. He was a pilot by instinct and a soldier by training, and every instinct he possessed was screaming that something had gone catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. Sam, his voice was steady. Barely. Talk to me. Lieutenant Colonel Samantha Carter didn't look up from her console. Her fingers moved across the ASGARD interface with the focused precision of someone who understood exactly how bad the situation was and had chosen, consciously, not to panic about it yet. Around her, the soft blue glow of the ASGARD core pulsed unevenly, a heartbeat that had once been perfectly rhythmic and was now skipping in ways that made every engineer on the ship deeply uncomfortable. The hyperdrive didn't just malfunction, she said. Her voice carried the particular flatness of a brilliant mind working through something that didn't have a precedent. The ASGARD core attempted a self-optimization during the jump sequence. It interfaced with the hyperdrive's navigational matrix and tried to calculate a more efficient route in real time. She paused. It succeeded. We traveled approximately 1.4 billion light-years in 4.3 seconds. The bridge went very quiet. That's, Mitchell started. Impossible, yes. I know. Carter finally looked up, and the expression on her face was the one Mitchell had learned over years of impossible situations to read correctly, not fear, not defeat, but the particular electric focus that meant she was already 3 steps into solving a problem that would have broken anyone else. The ASGARD core is damaged. The hyperdrive is offline. We have shields, weapons, life support, and sublight engines. That's what we have. From the tactical station, the voice of the ship's weapons officer cut across the bridge. Colonel Mitchell. I'm picking up a contact. Large vessel. Unknown configuration. Bearing 27 Mark IV. Range, approximately 40,000 kilometers and closing. Mitchell was on his feet before the sentence was finished. On screen. The main view screen shifted, and the Odyssey's crew saw it for the first time, a ship unlike anything in the database. Ancient in the truest sense of the word. Massive and weathered, her hull bearing the accumulated scars of millions of years of travel through the deep universe. She moved with the slow, inevitable momentum of something that had long ago stopped worrying about obstacles, her body etched with geometric patterns that caught the distant starlight and held it like memory. Running lights blinked in sequences that seemed almost deliberate. Almost communicative. She's enormous, someone on the bridge said quietly. She's broadcasting on multiple frequencies, the communications officer reported. I'm picking up radio, subspace, and something the computer doesn't have a classification for. There's also an active Stargate. Daniel Jackson appeared at Mitchell's shoulder. He had been in the ship's lower levels when the disaster struck, buried in his laptop and a half-translated gold text, and he'd made it to the bridge with ink on his left hand and a look of barely contained fascination already taking over his face. Daniel's expression in the presence of the unknown was one of Mitchell's favorite things about the man, where soldiers saw threat and engineers saw problem, Daniel saw story. That's ancient architecture, Daniel said softly. That ship is ancient. Or built by ancients. Or, he stopped himself. She's old, Cam. Older than anything we've ever encountered. Older than Atlantis. TEALC stood at the edge of the viewscreen's glow with his arms folded and his expression unreadable in the way that meant he was paying very close attention to everything. The vessel does not appear to be taking hostile action, he observed. However, its course has altered. It is moving toward us. They know we're here, Vala said. She had appeared from somewhere near the back of the bridge, her dark hair slightly disheveled and a bruise forming on her cheekbone from where she'd hit a console during the jump. She was studying the ancient ship with an expression that was equal parts wariness and calculation. Question is whether that's a good thing or a very bad thing. Hailing frequencies, Mitchell said. Already open, sir. Mitchell straightened. He'd made first contact before. With allies, with enemies, with things that defied every category humanity had invented. He knew the weight of the first words. He knew that tone mattered as much as content, and that the universe, in his experience, rewarded neither arrogance nor weakness. This is Colonel Cameron Mitchell of the United States Air Force vessel Odyssey. We have sustained significant damage and are currently unable to achieve hyperspace. We are not a threat. We are asking for communication and, if possible, assistance. He paused, then added, we come in peace. Yes, I know how that sounds. We mean it. For 4 seconds, there was nothing but static. Then a voice came through. Male. Tense. Scottish. This is Dr. NICHOLASRUSH aboard the ancient vessel Destiny. Colonel Mitchell, a pause that contained what sounded like several competing emotions fighting for dominance. I have a great many questions. Starting with how, precisely, you got out here. Mitchell glanced at Carter. Carter glanced at the ASGARD core. Yeah, Mitchell said into the comm, us too. If you want to see more crossover stories like this one, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a universe you'd want to see collide with another in the comments below. May the stars guide you. Trust, in the deep universe, was a currency more precious than Naquata and harder to manufacture than a ZPM. The crew of the Destiny had learned that lesson the hard way. Learned it through Lucian Alliance invasions, through body-swapping stones that violated every boundary a human being thought they owned, through commanders who made decisions that got people killed and were right anyway and wrong anyway and sometimes both at once. They had learned to be careful with trust in ways that people back on Earth, with their safety nets and their command structures and their ability to dial home, never truly had to be. Colonel Everett Young stood in Destiny's makeshift command center and watched the USS Odyssey on the ship's main screen with the expression of a man who had long ago made peace with the fact that the universe was going to keep surprising him in ways that were almost never pleasant. The BC-304 was real. The ASGARD power signatures were real. The life signs, dozens of them, human, Jaffa, and one that the sensors flagged with a notation that simply read unknown biological classification, were real. None of that made him feel better. Eli. Young's voice was quiet and even. What are we looking at? Eli Wallace had both hands moving across his console with the rapid, slightly manic energy that meant he was genuinely excited and trying very hard to appear professionally calm. He was failing at the second part. Okay, so. That is a Daedalus-class BC-304 battlecruiser. Earth-built. ASGARD upgraded. We're talking ASGARD plasma beam weapons, ASGARD shields, ASGARD beaming technology, an ASGARD computer core that is currently reading as damaged but still partially functional. He paused to breathe. She's also carrying F-302 fighters in her hangar bay and enough firepower to make Destiny's weapons look like. Eli. Right. Bottom line. If they're hostile, we have a problem. If they're friendly, we have, he searched for the word. Something else. From across the room, Rush hadn't moved from the console where he'd taken the initial hail. He was still standing with his arms crossed and his eyes fixed on the Odyssey's sensor profile, and the expression on his face was the one that Young had learned meant Rush was thinking approximately 6 steps ahead of everyone else in the room and enjoying it in a way he would never openly admit. The Asgard core signature is consistent with the upgrades given to Earth's fleet in the final days before the Asgard's extinction, Rush said without looking up. Which means this ship is from our timeline. Our Earth. The question isn't whether they're human. He finally turned. The question is how they got here, and whether their technology changes our situation. And whether we can trust them, Lieutenant Tamara Johansson said from near the door. TJ had been running medical assessments of her own crew since the hail came in, a habit born from experience, the instinct to know your people's status before an unknown variable entered the equation. We've been burned before by people who looked friendly. Chloe. Young didn't say more than her name, but the room understood. Chloe Armstrong, standing near the back with her arms folded across her chest, nodded slightly. She didn't say anything. She rarely needed to anymore. Young made his decision the way he made all decisions out here, quickly, with incomplete information, and with the full weight of responsibility sitting square on his shoulders where he'd put it himself. Open a channel. He spoke to Mitchell directly. Kept it short. Kept it honest. Told him that Destiny would allow a small team to come aboard via their Stargate, no more than 6 personnel, no weapons heavier than sidearms, no beaming directly onto the ship without prior authorization. He told him that Destiny's situation was complicated and that their resources were limited and that any arrangement between their crews would need to be negotiated, not assumed. Mitchell's response came back without hesitation, agreed on all counts. That, Young thought, was either the sign of a man who was genuinely reasonable or a man who was very good at appearing that way. He'd met both kinds. The Stargate activated with its familiar blue cascade 40 minutes later, and they came through one at a time. Mitchell first, tall, easy in his movement, with the particular confidence of someone who'd walked through gates into unknown situations enough times that the fear had been replaced by something more functional. Then Carter, who took exactly 3 seconds to visually assess Destiny's gate room and whose expression shifted through surprise, recognition, and intense scientific interest in a way that Young found oddly reassuring. Then the large one, TEALC, whose physical presence recalibrated everyone's sense of scale and whose single raised eyebrow conveyed approximately a paragraph's worth of observation. Then Jackson, who was already looking at the walls. Then the woman. Vala, who stepped through the gate with a smile that was friendly and guarded simultaneously and immediately began cataloging the room with eyes that Young recognized as the eyes of someone who'd spent significant time figuring out what things were worth. The 6th member of their team was a young technical sergeant named Renner who looked slightly green from the journey and immediately found a wall to stand near. Young stepped forward. Colonel Young. Welcome aboard Destiny. Mitchell shook his hand with a grip that was firm without being performative. Colonel Mitchell. Hell of a ship you've got here. She has her moments. Young studied the man. Direct eyes. Relaxed posture that was also somehow completely ready. A scar along his jaw that spoke to the kind of career that left marks. Dr. Rush briefed me on your communication. You have no hyperdrive. Correct. And you have no idea how you got here. Working on that. Young nodded slowly. Then we have something in common. He turned slightly, gesturing toward the corridor. I'll show you what we're dealing with. Then we talk about what comes next. Together. He let the word carry its weight. But I want to be clear, Colonel Mitchell. This is my ship. My crew. My call. That doesn't change regardless of what your vessel is carrying or what your rank structure says back in the Milky Way. Mitchell held his gaze for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, not challenge, not submission. Assessment. The look of a man measuring another man honestly. Understood, Mitchell said. Same page. Behind him, Carter was already looking at the corridor walls with the focused intensity of someone who had spotted something extraordinary and was exercising heroic restraint in not immediately asking about it. Daniel had drifted 6 feet toward a carved inscription above the gate room doorway and appeared to have temporarily forgotten he was in a diplomatic situation. TEALC looked at Young. Your vessel is ancient, he said. Not a question. 3 million years old, give or take, Young replied. TEALC considered this with the gravity it deserved. Impressive. Rush, appearing at Young's shoulder like a shadow that had decided to become a person, fixed his gaze on Carter with the particular intensity of a man who has just identified the most interesting person in any given room. Lieutenant Colonel Carter, he said. I've read your work on the Stargate. The wormhole physics. The Asgard core integration. A pause. I have questions. Carter looked at him with equal focus. So do I. Young almost smiled. Almost. This was either going to be the most productive collaboration in the history of human deep space exploration, or it was going to be an absolute disaster. Possibly both. Destiny was not a comfortable ship. She had never been designed for comfort, she had been designed for purpose, built by beings who measured existence in millennia and considered the minor inconveniences of biological life to be acceptable variables in a much larger equation. Her corridors were narrow in places and cathedral-wide in others, her lighting shifted between amber warmth and cold blue depending on which systems were drawing power and which had decided to rest, and her temperature varied deck by deck in ways that suggested the ship had opinions about where her crew spent their time. She was ancient and deliberate and faintly alien in the way that even the most familiar ancient technology always was. The sense that something vast and patient was paying attention just below the surface of every system, every door, every soft pulse of light in the walls. SG-1 noticed all of it. Mitchell walked Destiny's corridors with the measured pace of a man cataloging everything and filing it away, his hand never far from the P-90 at his side despite the agreement about sidearms only. Old habits. Good habits. The corridors smelled of recycled air and something faintly mineral, like stone that had been warm for a very long time, and the distant vibration of Destiny's sublight drives moved through the deck plating in a rhythm that was almost, but not quite, like a heartbeat. She's alive, Vala said quietly, walking just behind Mitchell with her hands clasped behind her back and her dark eyes moving across every surface. I don't mean that metaphorically. She feels alive. Ancient ships often do, Daniel said from beside her. He was moving slightly too slowly for the group, his attention constantly snagging on wall inscriptions, door symbols, the geometric patterning of the deck plating. Atlantis had it too. That sense of presence. Like the ship is aware of you. He paused at a junction, tilting his head at a sequence of symbols carved into the wall at eye level. Though these glyphs are older than anything I saw in Atlantis. This is early ancient. Prelantean. Some of these constructions, he stopped himself with visible effort and kept walking. Later. TEALC walked in silence, which was his default mode and also one of his most effective ones. His eyes moved in slow, methodical arcs. Threat assessment running continuously beneath the surface of his composure. He noted the positions of Destiny's crew members as they passed, the way some watched SG-1 with open curiosity, others with wariness, and a few with the flat careful look of people who had been surprised badly before and were determined not to be surprised again. He noted the wear on their uniforms, the particular quality of exhaustion in their faces. Not tiredness from a long shift but the deeper exhaustion of people who had been running on reduced resources for an extended period. He noted the absence of certain things. Surplus equipment. Spare parts. The easy confidence of people who knew that resupply was possible. These were people, TEALC concluded, who had been surviving rather than operating. Carter had been given, at her quiet but very direct request, a brief tour of Destiny's engineering spaces. Rush had provided it himself, which Young had allowed with the expression of a man who understood that the alternative was Carter finding her way there, independently within the hour. The engineering section was a revelation, ancient power distribution systems that made the Daedalus-class ships look like student projects, conduit architecture that operated on principles Carter recognized theoretically but had never seen implemented at this scale, and at the center of it all, Destiny's FTL drive. A technology that was not hyperspace in the Earth or Goa'uld sense, but something adjacent to it, something older, something that bent the relationship between space and time in ways that the Asgard had never quite achieved. Carter stood in front of the FTL drive housing and felt the particular sensation she associated with standing at the edge of a genuine frontier. The power draw during FTL is managed through a distributed network of secondary capacitors, Rush said, watching her with his arms crossed. His tone was academic, but his eyes were sharp, evaluating her reaction with the precision of a man who measured people by what they noticed. The primary capacitors charge from the stars. Destiny drops out of FTL to feed, essentially. It's elegant. It's extraordinary, Carter said. She meant it without reservation. The Asgard were brilliant engineers, but this, she gestured at the drive housing. This is a different philosophy entirely. They weren't trying to overcome the limitations of conventional physics. They were working with them. Treating them as features rather than obstacles. Rush was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. Exactly that. And something in his expression shifted fractionally. Not warmth, exactly, but recognition. The acknowledgement of a mind that had found another mind operating at a compatible frequency. Your Asgard core, he said. The damage. Significant but not catastrophic, Carter said. The core attempted a self-optimization during the hyperdrive jump. It calculated a more efficient route, executed it, and burned out several of its own primary interface nodes in the process. The hyperdrive is offline. The core itself is functional but operating at reduced capacity. Could it be repaired? Carter looked at him steadily. With the right materials and enough time, yes. But I'd need resources that the Odyssey isn't currently carrying in sufficient quantity. She paused. Resources that a ship 3 million years old, traveling through unexplored star systems, might have encountered. Rush held her gaze. That's a negotiation, he said. I'm aware. Back in Destiny's mess hall, a generous term for a space with functional tables, recycled food, and lighting that flickered when the ship made power allocation decisions, the human reality of two crews encountering each other was playing out with less strategic calculation and considerably more personality. ELIWALLACE had found Mitchell within 10 minutes of SG-1's arrival and had been unable to stop talking for the 20 minutes since. He had questions about the Odyssey's Asgard core, about F-302 combat performance, about what Earth was like now, about whether the Stargate program had gone public yet, about Mitchell's combat record, and, circling back with the enthusiasm of someone who had been starved of new intellectual company, about the Asgard core again. Mitchell answered with the patient good humor of a man who genuinely liked people and found Eli's specific brand of barely contained genius more endearing than exhausting. The Gate program's still classified, he said. Far as the public's concerned, we're just Air Force. Eli's expression suggested this was deeply unsatisfying. But you've saved the world. Multiple times. Comes with the job. That doesn't bother you? The not getting credit thing? Mitchell thought about it honestly. Some days, he said. Then I remember the alternative is a planet that knows about the Goa'uld and the Ori and the Wraith and everything else out there, and I figure the headache of keeping the secret is worth it. He paused. Besides, the people who matter know. Eli considered this with the expression of someone filing it away carefully. I used to play video games, he said. Now I'm on a 3-million-year-old spaceship 2 billion light-years from home trying to figure out the universe's oldest mystery. A beat. Honestly? Not that different. Mitchell laughed. Actually laughed. Yeah, he said. Sounds about right. Across the mess hall, Vala had located Chloe Armstrong, and the two women were engaged in a conversation that appeared, from the outside, to be about nothing in particular, and was almost certainly about everything that mattered. Vala had a gift for that, for finding the precise frequency on which another person was transmitting and tuning herself to match it. Chloe was guarded in the way of someone who had been through something that changed the fundamental texture of who they were, and Vala recognized that particular guardedness because she had worn it herself, in different circumstances, in different lives. She didn't push. She just talked. And listened. And let the silence do what silence did when it was handled correctly. Daniel had found the ship's database access terminal and was no longer visible. TEALC had positioned himself near the mess hall in trance with a cup of Destiny's reconstituted coffee which he had tasted once, assessed with Jaffa stoicism, and sat down and was watching everything with the calm of a man who had learned that the most important intelligence was gathered not in briefing rooms but in the unguarded moments when people forgot they were being observed. 2 Cruise. One ancient ship. The deep universe pressing against every hull plate. The culture clash, as Mitchell would later describe it in his report. The report he wasn't yet sure he'd ever be able to file, and was not a collision. It was more like two tectonic plates finding each other in the dark, feeling out the edges, deciding slowly and carefully whether they would slide or whether they would grind. So far, they were still deciding. The argument started, as the best arguments between brilliant people always do, over something that was simultaneously entirely technical and deeply personal. Carter had been given provisional access to Destiny's primary interface console, a concession Rush had made with the particular grace of a man granting a favor he intended to collect on later. And she had been working quietly and methodically for 3 hours, building a picture of the ASGARD core's damage profile and cross-referencing it against Destiny's available repair materials. She worked the way she always worked, systematically, thoroughly, with the focused patience of someone who had learned long ago that the universe rewarded precision over speed. Around her, Destiny's engineering crew moved with the careful choreography of people who had learned to share a limited workspace without friction, watching the newcomer with the particular attention of professionals evaluating another professional. Rush watched from across the room. He always watched. It was his primary mode of engagement with the world, observation first, interaction second, and only when interaction was unavoidable or strategically advantageous. What he observed was that Samantha Carter was exceptional. He had known this intellectually from her published work, the portions of it that had filtered through classified channels and the portions that hadn't but could be inferred from the gaps in the public record. But knowing a thing intellectually and watching it in operation were different experiences, and Rush was honest enough with himself, in the privacy of his own mind, to acknowledge that watching Carter work was like watching someone else play an instrument he had mastered and discovering they had found notes he hadn't considered. It was deeply uncomfortable. It was also, he would not admit to anyone, slightly thrilling. The argument ignited when Carter looked up from her console and said, with the careful neutrality of someone raising a subject they know is charged, the ASGARD core could interface with Destiny's systems directly. Rush uncrossed his arms and recrossed them in the other direction. No. I haven't finished the sentence. You didn't need to. He moved toward her console with the precise controlled energy of a man who had strong feelings he was managing aggressively. The ASGARD core's architecture operates on a fundamentally different computational philosophy than Destiny's systems. A direct interface without extensive mediation protocols would be like connecting two different programming languages through a universal translator, Carter said. Which is exactly what the ASGARD core's adaptive interface was designed to do. It translated between ASGARD, ancient, Goa'uld, and Earth computer systems. That's its primary function, Dr. Rush. Interoperability. In your galaxy, Rush said. Where those systems were designed with compatible foundational mathematics. Destiny's core architecture predates the development of standardized ancient computational theory by approximately 1 million years. He pulled up a holographic display of Destiny's primary systems matrix, a three-dimensional web of interdependencies so complex that it looked less like engineering and more like a nervous system. Every system on this ship is integrated at a level that your ASGARD core has never encountered. A poorly mediated interface doesn't just risk the core. It risks destiny. Carter studied the display. Rush watched her study it. The engineering crew pretended to be busy with other things. You're right about the integration complexity, Carter said finally. Rush blinked. He had been prepared for several responses. That was not one of them. The foundational mathematics are different enough that a direct interface would need significant mediation architecture before it attempted any system integration, Carter continued. But, she pulled up her own display, overlaying it against his in a way that required his implicit cooperation to render correctly, and after a fractional hesitation he provided it. The ASGARD core's damage is concentrated in its hyperdrive interface nodes. Not its computational core. Not its adaptive interface architecture. If we're not asking it to drive the ship, we're asking it to talk to the ship. That's a different problem. Rush looked at the overlaid display. His jaw tightened slightly. The power requirements for a mediated interface of that complexity would draw from Destiny's reserves during a period when we cannot afford. I can run the mediation architecture off the Odyssey's power grid, Carter said. Keep the draw off Destiny entirely. The core provides the translation layer. Destiny provides nothing except a read-only data port. Silence. Rush stared at the display for a long moment. The engineering crew was no longer pretending to be busy with other things. Read-only, he said. Until we've fully characterized the interface and both of us are satisfied it's safe to go further, Carter said. Your ship. Your call on when that threshold is met. Another silence. Longer. Read only, Rush said again. Not a question this time. An agreement dressed in the clothes of a repetition, which was as close as Nicholas Rush came to saying the words "you make a fair point." Eli, who had been observing from a respectful distance with the expression of someone watching two grandmasters play chess, let out a breath he'd been holding for approximately 4 minutes. While Carter and Rush negotiated the future of human ancient computational relations, Mitchell had found Colonel Young in Destiny's observation deck, a domed space at the ship's stern where the ancient transparent material of the dome revealed the deep universe in all its indifferent majesty. Stars here were sparse and strange, their light shifted toward colors that spoke of distances the human brain was not architected to genuinely comprehend. Young stood with his hands clasped behind his back and the expression of a man who spent a lot of time in this room. Mitchell stood beside him without speaking for a moment. He'd learned, over years of command and near command and the complicated space between, that some conversations needed to breathe before they started. How long? Mitchell asked finally. Long enough, Young said. Long enough that some of my people have stopped thinking about going home as a plan and started thinking about it as a dream. A pause. We've been out here approximately 18 hours, Mitchell said. So we're still in the plan stage. He looked at the stars. Though Carter's preliminary numbers on the hyperdrive repair timeline are not encouraging. How long? Best case. Weeks. Worst case. Mitchell let the sentence trail off in the direction of answers neither of them wanted to say out loud. Young nodded slowly. Then you're with us for a while. Looks that way. Your crew. Your ship. Young turned to look at him directly. The Odyssey stays positioned alongside Destiny. She doesn't operate independently without my knowledge. Her weapons don't go active without my authorization except in immediate self-defense. He held Mitchell's gaze steadily. I'm not trying to be territorial, Colonel. I'm trying to keep both our crews alive in an environment that has killed a lot of good people who didn't take it seriously enough. Mitchell met his eyes. What are we dealing with out here? Young was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the particular weight of a man who had paid for his knowledge in a currency he'd rather not have spent. Automated weapons drones, pre-programmed to destroy any ship that approaches certain regions of space. We don't fully understand their targeting parameters. We don't have a reliable way to communicate with them. And they are, he paused. Persistent. How persistent? They destroyed a Nakai vessel 3 times our size in approximately 8 minutes. Mitchell absorbed this. And Destiny's weapons? Effective, Young said. In the way that a good defense is effective when you have enough ammunition and enough power and enough time. We don't always have all 3 simultaneously. Mitchell looked back at the stars. He thought about the Odyssey's ASGARD plasma beams. He thought about the F-302s in the hangar bay and the pilots who flew them. He thought about TEALC's instinct, which had been sending low-level tactical signals since they'd come aboard, and about the way Young's crew moved through this ship. Purposefully, carefully, with the particular economy of motion of people who had learned not to waste anything. The Odyssey has ASGARD plasma beam weapons, Mitchell said. And pilots who've been in worse than drones. Young looked at him. I'm not offering to take point, Mitchell said carefully. I'm offering to stand next to you. He paused. There's a difference. Young studied him for a long moment with the evaluating eyes of a commanding officer who had learned to read people quickly because the alternative was learning slowly and paying in lives. Yes, Young said. There is. He turned back to the stars. Outside the dome, Destiny moved through the deep universe on her ancient and patient course, carrying her cargo of stranded humans toward a destination none of them fully understood yet. Behind her, matching course and speed with the quiet loyalty of a ship that had been asked to follow and had chosen to trust the asking, the USS Odyssey kept pace, her running lights steady in the dark, her damaged ASGARD core pulsing its uneven heartbeat into the void. In Destiny's engineering section, Carter and Rush were building something together that neither of them had built before. In the observation deck, 2 commanders had reached the beginning of an understanding. And somewhere in the deep universe ahead, beyond the sparse and ancient stars, something that had been dormant for a very long time had registered the energy signatures of an ASGARD core and begun, slowly and with great mechanical patience, to wake up. They came from the dark between stars, as they always did. No warning. No hail. No escalating threat display that gave a crew time to breathe and think and prepare. The Berserker drones operated on programming that was 3 million years old and had never been updated because the civilization that wrote it had ascended and left their weapons running on a logic that brooked no negotiation and recognized no context. They were not malicious. They were not cruel. They were simply and completely and terrifyingly purposeful, autonomous weapons platforms designed to eliminate any vessel operating advanced technology in regions of space their creators had designated as protected, and they had been doing exactly that, without rest or doubt or mechanical fatigue, since before human civilization had learned to write. Destiny's sensors screamed first. Eli was at his console when the contact appeared. Not one signature but 11, emerging from the sensor shadow of a dense dust nebula approximately 200,000 kilometers off Destiny's port bow, accelerating with the smooth exponential urgency of machines that did not need to worry about the biological consequences of high-G maneuvers. They were small, each drone, relative to either capital ship. Roughly the size of a shuttle, teardrop-shaped, their surfaces a dark alloy that absorbed sensor returns and made precise targeting calculations significantly harder than anyone preferred. They moved in formation with the unhurried confidence of weapons platforms that had never encountered a target that successfully ran from them. "Drones," Eli said, and the single word carried a specific quality of dread that only came from experience. 11 contacts. Bearing, he was already running calculations. They've seen us both. They're splitting targeting, 6 on Destiny, 5 on the Odyssey. Young was in the command center in 40 seconds. Rush was already there. FTL status, Young said. Charging, Rush said. 12 minutes to threshold. We don't have 12 minutes, Eli said. Young keyed the ship-wide comm, "All hands, this is Colonel Young. Battle stations. This is not a drill." He switched frequencies. "Mitchell." Mitchell's voice came back immediately. He was already on the Odyssey's bridge. Young could hear the controlled urgency of a crew snapping to combat readiness in the background. "We see them. 5 contacts on our sensors, coming in fast. Asgard shields are up. Plasma beams are warm." A brief pause. "Your call, Colonel." Young looked at Rush. Rush was already running tactical projections on his console, his fingers moving with the rapid precision of a man for whom multitasking was not a skill but a default state. "Destiny's weapons can handle 6 drones," Rush said. "Probably. At current power allocation." He didn't elaborate on the probably. He didn't need to. "Mitchell," Young said. "Engage your 5. Defensive posture, keep them off the Odyssey. If you get clean shots on any of Destiny's 6, take them. Don't ask first." "Understood." A beat. Launching F-302s. In the Odyssey's hangar bay, the launch sequence was already running. The F-302s came off the magnetic catapults in pairs, punching out into the deep universe with the clean controlled violence of precision-engineered aerospace fighters meeting an environment they were built for. There were 8 of them. A full complement, their pilots strapped in and heads-up displays already painting the incoming drone contacts in sharp tactical red. They were Air Force pilots, USAF officers who had trained against Wraith darts and Goa'uld Death gliders and Ori fighters and the particular brand of intimate mortal chaos that came from dogfighting in vacuum, and they assessed the incoming drones with the focused professional calm of people who had long ago separated fear from function. The drones assessed the F-302s in approximately 0.3 seconds and recalibrated their attack vectors accordingly. The first exchange was fast and brutal and educational for everyone involved. 2 drones peeled from the group targeting the Odyssey and redirected toward the F-302 screen, accelerating beyond what their approach velocity had suggested was their maximum speed. The lead F-302 pilot, Captain Reyes, who had 2 confirmed Wraith dart kills and a reputation for aggressive geometry, broke hard into the attack angle and fired her forward cannons in a sustained burst that connected with the first drone's forward surface and did precisely nothing. "Cannon fire is ineffective," Reyes reported, her voice carrying the flat professional quality of a pilot who had processed a critical tactical update and was already adapting. "Their hull is absorbing direct fire." "Missiles?" "Missiles," her wingman confirmed, and 4 AIM-120 equivalents tracked clean and true and impacted the second drone in a sequence of coordinated explosions that staggered it, damaged its port maneuvering surface, and slowed it without stopping it. "Missiles are effective," Reyes said. "Requiring multiple hits for kill." On the Odyssey's bridge, Carter had the ASGARD plasma beams coordinated before the F-302s had completed their first pass. The plasma beams were a different category of weapon from anything the drones had been programmed to anticipate, ASGARD technology operating on energy principles that were genuinely alien to the ancient engineering of the drones themselves, and the targeting computer of a drone that had been designed to counter ancient and primitive spacefaring technology had a half-second processing gap when it encountered the plasma beam's energy signature. Half a second was enough. The first ASGARD plasma beam hit connected with a drone at full power and converted it from a functioning weapons platform into a rapidly expanding debris field. The second beam tracked to a second drone and hit at a slightly lower power level. The drone's evasion subroutine had partially compensated and damaged it severely enough that its attack vector became erratic. The third beam missed entirely as 3 drones simultaneously broke formation and began independent evasion patterns that the targeting computer needed 1.2 seconds to process. 1.2 seconds in which 2 drones fired. The Odyssey shuddered as their energy weapons connected with the ASGARD shields. The shields held ASGARD technology meeting ancient technology in a collision of engineering philosophies. But the power draw registered immediately across every system on the ship, and Carter's tactical display showed the shield efficiency dropping from 100% to 83% in a single exchange. Shields at 83, the tactical officer reported. They hit hard. Yes, they do, Carter said. Continuous fire, rotating plasma beam emitters. Don't give their targeting systems time to adapt. Destiny was doing it differently, because Destiny always did things differently. Young stood in the command center and managed the battle with the particular style that his crew had learned, not the crisp top-down authority of a conventional military engagement but something more organic, more distributed, born from months of operating a ship where survival depended on everyone's best thinking rather than the hierarchy's best orders. Destiny's weapons were powerful and ancient and not especially precise by modern standards. They were built for a different era of space combat, designed to engage targets at ranges and speeds that reflected the technology of 3 million years ago, and the Berserker drones, which were of the same era, knew how to move against them with an intimacy born from having faced similar weapons before. But they had not faced them in combination with ASGARD plasma beams and F-302 fighters simultaneously. They're confused, Eli said, not with satisfaction but with the focused excitement of someone watching a real-time tactical problem resolve in an unexpected direction. Their formation algorithm is trying to prioritize targets and look at this, it's cycling. It can't decide whether the F-302s are primary threats or secondary. They weren't programmed for this many simultaneous threat categories. Rush looked at the display. They'll adapt, he said. These systems are self-modifying within defined parameters. Give them 90 seconds. Then we have 90 seconds, Young said. Eli, what do we need? If the Odyssey can keep 3 drones occupied for 60 seconds, Eli said, I can route enough power from the secondary capacitors to the forward weapons array to hit the remaining 3 with a sustained burst that should overwhelm their defensive shielding. Mitchell, Young said into the comm. Mitchell's voice came back over the sounds of a ship in combat, alerts, reports, the distant resonant thrum of plasma beams firing. Heard it. We'll take 3. You've got 60 seconds, Colonel Young. Make it count. The Odyssey turned. It was not an elegant maneuver. BC-304s were powerful ships and not especially graceful ones, built for endurance and firepower rather than the fluid agility of a fighter. But Mitchell's pilot brought her around with a controlled aggression that put the Odyssey directly between 3 of Destiny's targeting drones and Destiny herself, and the ASGARD plasma beams opened up in a continuous rotating fire that forced all 3 drones into defensive evasion patterns. 3 drones chasing 1 ship. 5 F-302s harassing 2 more. That left Destiny's forward weapons array a clear targeting solution on the remaining 3. Rush handled the power routing himself. Eli handled the targeting. Young watched. The forward array fired. Not a pulse. Not a burst. A sustained beam that lasted 4.7 seconds and drew from reserves that made every light on Destiny flicker simultaneously and caused the life support system to briefly reduce oxygen flow to 3 uninhabited decks. When it ended, 3 drones were gone. The remaining 5 drones, 2 engaged with the Odyssey, 2 harassing the F-302 screen, 1 that had taken missile hits and was operating at reduced capacity, ran their adaptation cycle in the silence that followed the beam's termination, processed the new tactical landscape, calculated outcomes, and reached a conclusion that their programming had reached before in similar circumstances. They disengaged. Not retreating. Drones did not retreat in any meaningful psychological sense. They recalculated. They withdrew to reassess and return with adjusted parameters. It was a distinction without practical comfort, but it was accurate. The F-302s watched them go. Reyes brought her fighter alongside the Odyssey's hull on a slow victory pass and resisted, professionally, barely, the urge to say something triumphant over the open comm channel. In Destiny's command center, the tension didn't break so much as it slowly, carefully, began to exhale. Young keyed the comm, Mitchell. Good flying. Mitchell's voice came back dry and steady. Your forward array is something else, Colonel. Remind me not to be in front of it. Noted. Young looked at Eli. How long before they come back? Eli's expression answered before his words did. They always come back. Young nodded. He had known that. He had asked anyway, because sometimes the act of asking a hard question out loud was the first step in building a plan to answer it. Then we need a better plan than we had today, he said. He looked at Rush. Rush looked at the doorway, where Carter had appeared, having left the Odyssey's bridge to someone competent the moment the engagement ended, with a tablet in her hand and the expression of a person who had been thinking during the battle and had arrived at something. The Asgard core, Carter said. The interface we discussed. I want to start tonight. Rush looked at her. Looked at Young. Looked back at Carter. Tonight, he agreed. Command was lonelier than it looked from the outside. Mitchell had known this for years, had understood it intellectually long before he'd felt it in his bones the way he felt it now, sitting in the Odyssey's small captain's mess with a cup of coffee that had gone cold 40 minutes ago and a tactical assessment report on his tablet that he'd read 3 times without retaining. The battle had been won, if you used the word loosely and didn't look too carefully at the shield efficiency numbers or the missile expenditure report or the F-302 that had taken a glancing drone hit on its port stabilizer and was now sitting in the hangar bay requiring repairs that the Odyssey's engineering team could handle but would have preferred not to need to. 6 drones destroyed. 5 withdrawn. No casualties. By any reasonable measure, that was a victory. By the measure Mitchell was currently applying, the one that calculated not what had happened but what could have happened, and what would happen when the drones came back with adjusted parameters, it was a warning. His door chimed. Come in. Young entered with his own coffee, Destiny's reconstituted variety, which Mitchell had tried once and classified alongside field rations and gate travel as necessary unpleasantness. And sat across the table with the ease of a man who had spent enough time in difficult conversations to have stopped performing comfort he didn't feel. They sat in silence for a moment. 2 commanding officers in a small room, the deep universe pressing against the hull, the faint vibration of Destiny's drives running beneath everything like a bass note that never resolved. Your tactical coordination during the engagement, Young said. The maneuver that screened our forward arc. That wasn't in any plan we discussed. No, Mitchell agreed. Eli said 60 seconds. I found 60 seconds. Young looked at him. You put the Odyssey between those drones and Destiny deliberately. Without being asked. You had the shot. We had the shields. Mitchell shrugged, but it was a considered shrug, not a casual one. Seemed like math. Young was quiet for a moment. It was good math, he said. I want you to know I noticed. He set his cup down. I also want you to know that if you'd made that call without it being the right call, we'd be having a very different conversation. Mitchell met his eyes. Understood. Good. Young leaned back slightly. I've been thinking about command structure. Here it was, Mitchell thought. The conversation he'd known was coming since the moment he'd shaken Young's hand in the gate room and felt the particular quality of authority the man carried, not the loud, performative kind, but the deep, load-bearing kind. The kind that came from having made decisions that cost people things and having lived with the weight of those decisions without letting it crush the capacity to make the next one. We have 2 ships and 2 crews operating in the same threat environment, Young said. That works in a fleet engagement when there's a clear command hierarchy and everyone knows their role. Out here, with no fleet and no hierarchy above either of us, it's more complicated. What are you proposing? Young considered his words carefully. Destiny leads. She knows this region of space better than the Odyssey ever will. Her databases, her FTL capability, her established routes. Her crew knows the threats, the patterns, the rhythms of this part of the universe. He paused. But the Odyssey has capabilities Destiny doesn't. ASGARD weapons. ASGARD shields. F-302s. Beaming technology. Your people's experience with a wider variety of enemy types. He looked at Mitchell directly. I'm not asking you to serve under me. I'm asking you to operate with me. There's a difference. Mitchell thought about that. He thought about what it would cost him. Not personally, not in pride, because he'd long ago separated pride from principle, but operationally. The Odyssey's crew were Air Force. They had a command structure, a hierarchy, a set of protocols that existed for reasons that had been learned through hard experience. Ambiguity in command during a crisis cost seconds, and seconds in a crisis cost lives. Defined boundaries, Mitchell said. Destiny and Odyssey maintain independent internal command. My crew reports to me. Yours reports to you. Joint operations, anything that involves both ships in an active threat scenario, we coordinate in real time, and in cases of genuine disagreement about tactical approach, we default to your call because you know this universe and I don't. Yet. He paused. Non-tactical decisions, resource allocation, route planning, contact protocols, we discuss and agree. Not one commander overriding the other. Young studied him. That's almost exactly what I was going to propose. I've had a lot of difficult command conversations, Mitchell said. I've learned to think ahead. Young almost smiled. Deal. He extended his hand, and Mitchell shook it, a different handshake from the one in the gate room. That one had been introduction. This one was agreement. The difficult conversation happening simultaneously in Destiny's corridor outside the science section was less structured and considerably louder. It had started as a tactical debrief between Rush and Sergeant RONALDGREER and had escalated, with the speed of interactions between those two particular personalities, into something that had drawn a small audience of crew members who found reasons to be nearby and stay there. Greer's position was straightforward and he stated it with the direct force that was his default mode of communication. The F-302 pilots had performed well, the Odyssey's weapons had been decisive, and SG-1's presence. Specifically Mitchell's tactical decision to screen Destiny's forward arc, had materially affected the outcome of the engagement in Destiny's favor. This was not a reason for suspicion. This was a reason for trust. Rush's position was equally clear and stated with the particular brand of precise condescension that was his default mode when he believed he was the only person in a conversation thinking past the immediate. The engagement had been won with relative ease because the drones had not yet adapted to the Odyssey's weapons profile. When they returned, and they would return having processed everything they'd observed. The Odyssey's ASGARD plasma beams would be less effective on the second engagement than the first. The F-302 missile approach would be anticipated. And at that point, the additional tactical value of SG-1's presence would be partially offset by the additional threat profile their technology had created. "You're saying they made things worse," Greer said, with the careful flatness of a man exercising significant restraint. "I'm saying they changed the threat parameters in ways we haven't fully assessed," Rush said. "That's not the same thing, and the distinction matters. The distinction is that 6 fewer drones exist in this universe," Greer said. "I'm comfortable with that distinction. You're comfortable with the short term. I'm concerned about Dr. Rush." The voice came from the doorway, and both men turned. TEALC stood there with his hands clasped behind his back and the serene expression of a Jaffa warrior who had watched empires rise and fall and was not especially troubled by a corridor argument between two humans. He had been listening, as he often was, and had decided to participate, which he did far more selectively. "I have encountered similar disagreements in my experience," TEALC said. "Among the Jaffa. Among the Tauri. Among many peoples who found themselves in alliance during difficult circumstances." He looked at Rush with the measured calm of someone who was about to say something that would be entirely reasonable and therefore impossible to argue with. "The concern that an ally's capabilities create new vulnerabilities is valid. It is also incomplete." He paused. "A warrior who refuses an ally's shield because the shield attracts attention will eventually fall to a blow the shield would have turned." Greer pointed at TEALC with an expression that said exactly. Rush looked at TEALC for a long moment. The corridor was very quiet. "That's a reductive analogy," Rush said finally. "It is," TEALC agreed pleasantly. "And yet." Rush said nothing. Which, from Rush, was its own form of concession. Greer watched Rush walk away and then looked at TEALC with something close to admiration. "How do you do that?" "Many years of practice," TEALC said. "And a sufficiently deep voice." In the science section, Carter and Eli had been working in parallel for 6 hours, and the thing they were building had begun to take shape in the way that collaborative work between compatible minds sometimes did, not as the sum of two approaches but as something genuinely new that neither would have reached independently. The mediation architecture was elegant in the way of solutions that looked inevitable in retrospect and had been genuinely difficult to find. Carter's ASGARD core expertise provided the translation layer. Eli's intuitive understanding of Destiny's systems, the kind of understanding that came not from formal training but from months of intimate problem-solving necessity, provided the interface mapping. Together they had designed something that could sit between the two computational philosophies and allow them to speak without either having to fundamentally change its language. "If this works," Eli said, looking at their shared display with the expression of someone who had learned to be cautiously hopeful rather than freely hopeful because the universe had educated him on the difference, "we'll be able to read Destiny's full database through the ASGARD core's interface. Everything. Navigation charts. Ancient records. Technical specifications for systems we haven't even found yet." Carter looked at the architecture they'd built and ran through it one more time with the careful systematic thoroughness that had saved her life and other people's lives more times than she'd kept count. "It'll work," she said. Eli looked at her. "You sound sure." "I am sure," Carter said. "Not arrogance. Certainty grounded in evidence, which was a different thing. What I'm less sure about is what we'll find when it does." Eli was quiet for a moment. Outside Destiny's hull, the deep universe moved past in its sparse and ancient grandeur, star systems separated by distances that made even the word vast feel insufficient. "Daniel's been in the database access section for 9 hours, Eli said. Carter nodded. I know. He hasn't eaten. He won't, Carter said. Not until he finds whatever he's looking for. She paused. Or until it finds him. They both knew Daniel well enough. Or in Eli's case, had known him long enough to develop an intuition, to understand that Daniel Jackson in a 3-million-year-old ancient database was not a man doing research. He was a man following a thread that had already pulled taut, that had already told him something was at the other end, and that would not release him until he reached it. The question was what it was. The question was whether, once found, it would change everything. In Mitchell and Young's experience, separately earned, similarly weighted, the answer to that particular question was almost always yes. Daniel Jackson had not slept. This was not unusual. Daniel's relationship with sleep had always been negotiable. Subject to revision whenever something sufficiently compelling presented itself on the other side of the equation, and a 3-million-year-old ancient database containing records from before the Lantean period, before the Great Migration, before the war with the Wraith and the abandonment of Pegasus and all the cascading consequences that had shaped everything humanity had subsequently encountered in the wider universe, was sufficiently compelling by a margin that made the word insufficient. He sat in Destiny's database access section surrounded by holographic displays that he had multiplied until they formed a loose constellation around his chair, each one carrying a different thread of inquiry, and he moved between them with the focused restlessness of a man following multiple lines of evidence toward a convergence point he could feel but not yet see. His coffee. Eli had brought it 4 hours ago with the specific instruction that he drink it, which he had interpreted as a suggestion, sat untouched and cold at his elbow. A half-eaten protein bar occupied the corner of his workspace in the way of things that had been consumed functionally rather than enjoyed. The ancient script flowed across his displays in the angular precision of a language he had spent more of his adult life with than any spoken tongue, and he read it the way fluent readers read. Not decoding, but absorbing, the meaning arriving whole rather than assembled piece by piece. Most of what he had found in the first hours had been navigational data, stellar cartography, records of star systems visited and catalogued during Destiny's long automated journey, before her crew had arrived. Extraordinary in its scope, invaluable for understanding this region of the universe, but not what the pull was directing him toward. Then, 6 hours in, he had found the first marker. It was embedded in a navigation log from approximately 1.4 million years ago, a notation attached to a standard stellar observation record, the ancient equivalent of a margin note, written in a script style that was subtly different from the rest of the database. Older. More archaic. The handwriting, metaphorically speaking, of someone who had been using the language before it had fully standardized. The signal was observed again. Origin consistent with previous measurements. The builders did not create it. We have confirmed this. It predates us. Daniel had stared at that notation for 45 minutes. Then he had started pulling every related record he could find. He brought what he had to Young and Mitchell together, because he had learned. Through long experience of delivering information that changed the shape of a situation, that it was better to tell the people who needed to act on it simultaneously than to tell them sequentially and manage the gap between their reactions. He spread his tablet displays across the table in Destiny's command center and laid it out with the careful precision of an academic who had also been a soldier long enough to know how to brief. Destiny's mission, he said, is documented throughout the database in ways that Destiny's crew has already established. She was sent out to follow a signal embedded in the cosmic microwave background radiation. A signal that appears to be structured. Intentional. He paused. What isn't in the mission briefings, what's in the older records, the observation logs from the first automated centuries of the journey? Is that the ancients who sent Destiny knew more about the signal's origin than they included in the official mission parameters? Rush, standing across the table, had gone very still in the way he went still when information arrived that rearranged his model of a situation. What did they know? They knew it predated them, Daniel said. Not by centuries. Not by millennia. He let the pause do its work. By hundreds of millions of years. The signal was already ancient when the ancients were still learning to build starships. They sent Destiny not to find evidence of another civilization. He looked around the table. They sent her to find evidence of the first one. The silence that followed was the particular kind that arrived when a room full of people who dealt with extraordinary things on a regular basis encountered something that exceeded their existing scale of extraordinary. Eli made a sound that was not quite a word. Carter, who had been standing near the door with her arms crossed and her scientist's face on, the one that processed implications in parallel rather than sequence, said quietly. The signal they're following isn't a message. It's a beacon. That's my reading, Daniel said. The ancients believed, and their observations over the course of Destiny's journey appear to support, that the signal is not a recording. It's active. It's being generated. Right now. By something or someone that has been generating it continuously for longer than complex life has existed in this galaxy. Where? Young said. Daniel pulled up Destiny's navigational projection. The ship's calculated course, the long, winding path through galaxy after galaxy that she had been following for 3 million years, traced itself across the display. At its terminus, at the point where all the calculations and corrections and course adjustments converged, a region of space was highlighted. Still distant. Still, by any human scale of reckoning, almost incomprehensibly far. She's been heading there since she launched, Daniel said. Every course correction, every FTL jump, every star she's fed from, it's all been moving her toward that point. He looked at Young. Destiny isn't lost, Colonel. She's never been lost. She's exactly where she's supposed to be, doing exactly what she was sent to do. Young looked at the display for a long time. Mitchell stood beside him, and Mitchell's expression was the one he wore when he was taking something seriously that deserved to be taken seriously, no deflection, no humor, just the clean honest weight of a man confronting the full scale of what he was standing inside. How far? Young asked. At current FTL speed, Rush said, already running the calculations, his fingers moving across his own console with the rapid automaticity of a man for whom mathematics was reflex, accounting for necessary start stops and navigational variables, he stopped. His jaw tightened. Years, he said. Several years. Minimum. Young nodded. He had known, in the deep place where commanding officers kept the things they knew but couldn't yet say, that there was never going to be a quick ending to this. He had made his peace with that in increments, over months, and hearing the confirmation now did not break anything. It settled something, in the complicated way that certainty, even difficult certainty, was preferable to suspension. Daniel stayed after the others had filtered out to their stations and their duties and the particular internal work of absorbing large new information. He stayed because there was more, and he had held the more back not from deception but from the instinct. Developed over years of delivering paradigm-shifting information to people who then had to function, to give the first layer time to land before adding the second. Rush stayed too. He had known there was more. He was always waiting for the more. The notation I found, Daniel said when they were alone with the displays. The one about the signal predating the ancients. It wasn't anonymous. Rush looked at him. Who wrote it? Daniel pulled up the record. At the bottom of the ancient notation, in the archaic script of a language that had been old when Earth's first cities were being built, a designation was recorded. Not a name in the human sense. The ancients had not used names the way humans did in their earliest period, but an identifier. A marker of individual authorship in a civilization that had understood the importance of knowing who had observed what. Rush read it. His expression moved through several stages in rapid succession: recognition, disbelief, recalculation, and finally the particular focused intensity of a man who has just discovered that the rabbit hole goes considerably deeper than the rabbit hole he thought he was in. That's not possible, he said. It shouldn't be, Daniel agreed. And yet the linguistic analysis is consistent. The script style matches. The period markers are correct. He paused. Someone was on this ship, Rush. In the very early period of Destiny's journey. Someone who shouldn't have been here by any timeline we understand, and who left observations in the database that the rest of the crew either never found or chose not to include in the accessible mission records. Rush looked at the identifier for a long moment. Outside Destiny's hull, the universe continued its ancient and indifferent business. The stars moved in their slow galactic rotations. The signal. That structured, impossible, patient signal in the background radiation of the cosmos, continued broadcasting from its point of origin at the edge of what Destiny's journey was meant to reach. We need to find the rest of their records, Rush said. I've already started, Daniel said. Vala found Daniel 2 hours later, still at his console, a second untouched copy now keeping the first one company. She didn't ask what he'd found. She read it in the particular quality of his focus. Not the excited animation of a man making a discovery, but the careful, slightly odd stillness of a man, sitting with something that had changed his understanding of a thing he'd thought he understood. She sat beside him. She didn't speak. She had learned, over years of being Daniel Jackson's teammate, and then something more than that, and then something that had settled into its own category that didn't require a label, that there were moments when his processing needed company rather than conversation. After a while he said, without looking up, "We're not the first ones to do this, Vala." Do what? Any of it. He gestured at the displays, at the ship around them, at the universe beyond. Travel this far. Ask these questions. Follow something we didn't fully understand because the not following felt worse than the following. He was quiet for a moment. Someone did this before the ancients. Before anyone we know of. And they left notes. Vala looked at the ancient script on his display. She couldn't read it the way Daniel could, but she had spent enough time near him and near ancient technology to have developed an intuitive sense of when something was significant in the way that rearranged everything. Are they still out there? She asked. Whoever wrote this. Daniel looked at the display for a long time. I don't know, he said. But I think Destiny does. Outside, in the deep universe, the signal pulsed on in its patient and ancient rhythm, as it had for longer than any civilization currently existing had been alive to count. The drones came back in greater numbers than anyone had predicted and sooner than anyone had hoped. Destiny's sensors gave them 4 minutes of warning. Enough time for both crews to reach stations, for the F-302s to be prepped in the hangar bay, for Carter to run a rapid systems check on the Odyssey's ASGARD shields and find them at 91% efficiency after the repairs completed in the intervening hours. 4 minutes was not comfortable. 4 minutes was what they had. There were 23 of them this time. Eli counted them twice because the first count seemed wrong and the second count confirmed that it wasn't. 23 Berserker drones in a dispersed attack formation that was geometrically different from the formation they'd used in the first engagement, wider spacing, more complex approach vectors, the attack pattern of a system that had processed the first engagement and drawn conclusions. They came from 2 directions simultaneously, splitting their approach around the dust nebula's edge in a pincer that was designed to force both ships into a reactive posture before they could establish coordinated fire. They learned, Eli said, with the tone of someone who had hoped they wouldn't. Of course they learned, Rush said. He was already running projections. They're self-modifying autonomous systems with 3 million years of tactical experience. The question was never whether they would adapt. The question was how quickly. He looked at his display. 4 minutes and 37 seconds, as it turns out. Young keyed the calm, Mitchell. I see them. Mitchell's voice was steady in the way of a combat pilot who had converted fear into fuel long ago. 23 contacts. They've split the approach. Rush is right, they've adapted to our tactics from the last engagement. Plasma beam targeting windows are going to be significantly shorter. They've increased their evasion variance. Recommendations. A brief pause, not hesitation, Mitchell thinking in the compressed and efficient way of someone for whom tactical assessment was as natural as breathing. The Odyssey can't just sit and shoot this time. We need to move. Use our sublight speed to create unpredictable firing angles. Keep them from establishing a stable targeting solution on either ship. Another pause. And we need to use the F-302s differently. Last time they were screening, there were 23 of them this time. Eli counted them twice because the first count seemed wrong and the second count confirmed that it wasn't. 23 Berserker drones in a dispersed attack formation that was geometrically different from the formation they'd used in the first engagement, wider spacing, more complex approach vectors, the attack pattern of a system that had processed the first engagement and drawn conclusions. They came from two directions simultaneously, splitting their approach around the dust nebula's edge in a pincer that was designed to force both ships into a reactive posture before they could establish coordinated fire. They learned, Eli said, with the tone of someone who had hoped they wouldn't. Of course they learned, Rush said. He was already running projections. They're self-modifying autonomous systems with 3 million years of tactical experience. The question was never whether they would adapt. The question was how quickly. He looked at his display. 4 minutes and 37 seconds, as it turns out. Young keyed to calm Mitchell. I see them. Mitchell's voice was steady in the way of a combat pilot who had converted fear into fuel long ago. 23 contacts. They've split the approach. Rush is right, they've adapted to our tactics from the last engagement. Plasma beam targeting windows are going to be significantly shorter. They've increased their evasion variance. Recommendations. A brief pause, not hesitation, Mitchell thinking in the compressed and efficient way of someone for whom tactical assessment was as natural as breathing. The Odyssey can't just sit and shoot this time. We need to move. Use our sublight speed to create unpredictable firing angles. Keep them from establishing a stable targeting solution on either ship. Another pause. And we need to use the F-302s differently. Last time they were screening. 8 fighters, 2 missiles each, staggered timing to prevent the drone formation from processing and evading the full salvo simultaneously. 11 drones took hits of varying severity. 3 were destroyed outright. 4 were damaged and their approach vectors became erratic. 4 more absorbed hits that their shielding deflected and continued undeterred. 16 drones still combat effective, reorganizing rapidly. The Odyssey moved. Mitchell had taken the con personally for this engagement, which his bridge crew accepted without comment because they knew what it meant when their commanding officer sat in the chair himself. It meant the situation required the kind of instinctive tactical judgment that couldn't be fully delegated, the kind that lived in the hands and eyes of a pilot who had been doing this since before most of them were officers. He flew the Odyssey the way experienced pilots flew. Not by instrument alone but by feel, the ship's mass and momentum becoming an extension of his own body's intuition, the tactical display informing decisions that were already forming in the place below conscious thought. He put the Odyssey into a rolling arc that took her across the face of the drone formation's left pincer, her ASGARD plasma beams firing in rotating sequence, not sustained beams but rapid sequential pulses, a tactic Carter had calculated would reduce the drone's evasion effectiveness because their avoidance algorithms were optimized against sustained beam fire, not against the unpredictable timing variance of sequential pulse attacks. The plasma beams connected. 2 more drones destroyed. 1 severely damaged. The Odyssey's shields took 3 hits in rapid succession as the drone formation's right pincer reached effective weapons range, and the shield efficiency dropped from 91 to 67% in 8 seconds. The ship shuddered with each hit, not the gentle vibration of a vessel in atmosphere but the sharp full-body impact of energy. Weapons transferring enormous kinetic and thermal load through shielding that was doing its job at the absolute margin of its capacity. Shields at 67, the tactical officer reported. Holding, But if we take another concentrated salvo? We won't, Mitchell said, and brought the Odyssey around in a maneuver that used her sublight drives at 112% rated capacity and put 3 drones between the ship and their companions. Using the drones' own formation against them, forcing their targeting systems to calculate firing solutions that risked hitting their own units. The drones recalculated. 2 seconds. Carter used those 2 seconds to fire the ASGARD plasma beams at the 3 isolated drones from point-blank range. 3 more gone. Destiny was fighting a different battle. The 10 drones of the right pincer had reached her, and the engagement at close range was a different category of experience from the longer-range exchange the Odyssey was managing. Destiny's weapons were powerful, but their targeting systems were ancient, and the drones knew how to move against them, knew the tracking speeds, knew the firing arc limitations, knew the precise geometries that reduced their exposure while maximizing their own attack angles. Young managed it from the command center with the resource distribution thinking that had become his primary tactical mode, not where to direct firepower but where to direct power, which was a subtler and ultimately more consequential question. He pulled power from Destiny's already reduced reserves and routed it in pulses rather than sustained draws, giving the weapons array brief peaks of output that exceeded what a sustained draw could have maintained, at the cost of regular valleys where the ship's weapons' effectiveness dropped for 2-second intervals. It was a rhythm. A dangerous, carefully managed rhythm. Rush had calculated it. Eli was executing it. Young was watching it work and watching it strain simultaneously, the way a bridge flexes under load, functional, but with a perceptible awareness of the load. 6 drones were hammering Destiny's forward shields with a coordinated fire pattern that was designed to saturate rather than penetrate. Not trying to break through on any single hit but trying to keep the shields busy enough that their efficiency degraded gradually over the course of the engagement. It was working. Destiny's forward shields were at 54% and dropping. Rush, Young said. I see it, Rush said. Options. Rush was quiet for 1.3 seconds, which was a long time for Rush. The FTL drive is at 60% charge. If we jump now, short jump, micro jump, just enough to exit the engagement. We leave the Odyssey, Young said. Yes. Young didn't consider it. The decision was already made, had been made in the moment Young had shaken Mitchell's hand in the observation deck and said we operate together. Other options. Rush looked at his display with the expression of a man making calculations he didn't like. There's a power configuration I've been working on. Theoretical. I haven't tested it. He paused. It would route the FTL drive's charged energy through Destiny's weapons array. Not as FTL, as a directed discharge. One shot. Extremely high yield. How high? High enough to destroy every drone in our engagement range simultaneously. Rush met Young's eyes. It would also completely deplete the FTL charge. We'd be sublight for a minimum of 4 hours afterward. Sublight and vulnerable, Young said. Yes. But the drones would be gone. The drones in our immediate range would be gone, Rush said. There may be more. We don't know. Young looked at his display. Destiny's forward shields were at 49%. The Odyssey was still moving, still fighting, her shields down to somewhere in the 50s. Her F-302s thinning the drone numbers but not fast enough to relieve the pressure on either capital ship before something critical gave way. He keyed the comm, Mitchell. I need 60 seconds of clear space around Destiny. Whatever you can do. Mitchell's response was immediate. Copy that. 60 seconds. What the Odyssey did in those 60 seconds would become, in the accounts that Destiny's crew told later, one of those moments that people who were present for found difficult to describe to people who weren't. Mitchell flew the BC-304 at combat speeds through the space between the 2 drone formations, through the gap between the groups engaging Destiny and the Odyssey respectively. Drawing targeting attention from both groups simultaneously, the Asgard shields absorbing hit after hit as the plasma beams fired continuously and the ship moved in the controlled barely contained chaos of a vessel being flown at the absolute edge of its pilot's ability and its own structural tolerances. The shield efficiency dropped to 31%. Lieutenant Chen, 2 years out of the academy, who had requested this assignment specifically because he wanted to see what was beyond the Milky Way, ejected cleanly and was immediately tracked for recovery by the Odyssey's beaming system. Mitchell held the maneuver for 58 seconds. "Rush," Young said. "Now." The FTL discharge was not like a weapons blast in any conventional sense. It did not look like a beam or a pulse or any of the categories of directed energy that the crews of either ship had experience with. It looked like Destiny briefly became a star, a bloom of white-gold energy that expanded from the ship's weapons array in a sphere rather than a line, filling the space around her to a radius of 30,000 kilometers with an energy density that the drone's shielding, designed for a different era's weapons yields, could not process or deflect or survive. When it was over, the space around Destiny was empty. The remaining drones engaged with the Odyssey, 7 of them, all that remained of 23, registered the energy discharge, processed the elimination of their formation companions, recalculated outcomes, and disengaged. Not retreating. Recalculating. But gone for now, vanishing back toward the dust nebula with the patient mechanical purpose of systems that had time on their side. In the sudden silence, Destiny drifted on sublight drives, her FTL dark, her weapons array cooling, her hull radiating the residual heat of an energy output she had not attempted in a very long time. On the Odyssey's bridge, Mitchell sat in a command chair with the post-combat stillness of a pilot coming down from the sustained intensity of an engagement that had demanded everything, and breathed. "Shields at 28%, the tactical officer said quietly. "Hull integrity nominal. 1F-302 lost, pilot recovered." A pause. "We're still here, sir." "Yeah," Mitchell said. "We are." He keyed the comm, "Young. Nice shot." Young's voice came back, and there was something in it that hadn't been there before, not relief exactly, but the sound of a man who had made a decision that cost something significant and found it had been the right cost. "Your 60 seconds gave us the shot, Mitchell. We're even." Mitchell looked at the empty space where 23 drones had been. "Not even close," he said. "But we can settle up later." The hours after the battle had the particular quality of time that followed extreme effort, stretched and slow, filled with the small necessary work of damage assessment and repair and the internal accounting that people who had been in danger did privately, tallying what had been spent and what remained. Both ships ran diagnostics. Both crews ran their own quieter versions of the same process. Lieutenant Chen was checked by TJ and cleared with a bruised sternum and the specific expression of a young pilot who had ejected in combat for the first time and was still integrating the experience into his understanding of who he was. The Odyssey's shields needed 4 hours of automated regeneration. Destiny's FTL needed the same to recharge. In the overlap of those two vulnerabilities, both ships were as exposed as they would ever be in this region of space, and the command decision, made simultaneously by Young and Mitchell without needing to discuss it, was to use that time not for rest but for the thing that couldn't wait any longer. Daniel's discovery couldn't wait any longer. They convened in Destiny's largest meeting space. A room that the ship had apparently designed for exactly this kind of gathering, its dimensions generous enough to hold both crews' senior personnel without crowding, its ancient walls carrying the quiet ambient light that Destiny used in spaces it considered important. Young sat at the head of the table. Mitchell sat across from him. Between them, arranged in a loose configuration of people who had been through enough together to sit where they were comfortable rather than where protocol suggested, were Rush, Carter, Daniel, Vala, TEALC, Eli, TJ, Greer, Chloe, and Scott. Daniel laid it out completely this time. No staged delivery, no managed sequencing of revelations. All of it, from the margin notation in the navigation log to the authorial identifier to the subsequent records he and Rush had spent the intervening hours pulling from the deepest layers of the database, records that had been archived in a subsection of Destiny's memory that was not accessible through the standard interface and had required the Asgard Core's mediation architecture, now fully operational, to reach at all. The records told a story. Someone had traveled aboard Destiny in her early automated period, not as a passenger in any conventional sense, not living in the ship's quarters or eating from its stores, but present in the way that beings of sufficient advancement were present, their interaction with the physical world light and selective and leaving traces that were more like impressions than evidence. They had observed. They had recorded. They had left, in the database's deepest archive, a document that was not a mission log or a navigation record but something closer to what Daniel, after 9 hours with it, had come to think of as a testament. A record left for whoever eventually arrived. They knew someone would come, Daniel said. Eventually. They knew Destiny would reach her destination and that when she did, there would be beings aboard who needed to understand what they were approaching. He looked around the table. They left this for us. Specifically for whoever was on this ship when she got close enough. How close is close enough? Scott asked. Rush answered without looking up from his tablet. Based on the threshold parameters in the document, the distance at which certain signal characteristics become detectable at specific sensor resolutions, he paused. We crossed that threshold approximately 6 hours ago. The room absorbed this. They know we're here, Chloe said quietly. They've known since before we knew ourselves, Rush said. Carter had been reading her copy of the translated document throughout Daniel's briefing, and she looked up now with the expression that meant she had found the thing in the data that everyone else needed to see. The signal in the cosmic microwave background, she said. It's not just a beacon. The document describes it as a, Daniel, how do you translate this construction? Daniel looked at his notes. The closest English rendering is something like an invitation with terms, he said. The signal is a call. But it's also a test. Destiny's journey, the whole journey, every star she fed from, every galaxy she passed through, every course correction. It wasn't just navigation. He paused, making sure the weight of it landed correctly. It was a curriculum. Whatever is at the signal's origin designed Destiny's route to ensure that any crew that arrived would have encountered sufficient variety of circumstance, sufficient challenge, sufficient, the word in the document is something between growth and becoming, to be ready for what's there. Silence. Greer broke it, because Greer had a gift for asking the question the room was avoiding. Ready for what, exactly? Daniel looked at him. The document doesn't say. Not directly. He chose his next words carefully. What it says is that the nature of what's at the origin point cannot be described in language that beings at our current level of development would process correctly. That attempting to describe it would be, he checked his notes again. The phrase is like describing color to a closed eye. That's not reassuring, Eli said. No, Daniel agreed. It's not. Rush set his tablet down with the precise controlled movement of a man managing a strong internal response. What it tells us, he said, is that Destiny's mission is real. Not theoretical. Not the ancients sending a ship toward something they hoped was significant. They knew what was there. They knew what it meant. And they sent the ship anyway, sent her on a journey that would take millions of years because the journey itself was necessary preparation. He looked at Young. Everything we've been through out here. Every crisis, every loss, every impossible problem we solved because there was no alternative. Was supposed to happen, Young said. Was necessary to happen, Rush said. The document is explicit on this point. The crew that arrives must have been tested by the journey. Crews that didn't survive the testing, he paused. Destiny's database records previous crew complements. Before us. The silence that followed this was a different quality from the ones before it. Young looked at Rush for a long moment. How many? 3, Rush said. All in the early automated period, before Destiny had developed the ship-tending protocols that keep the current systems functional. All small crews. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. We're not the first people who tried to do this, TJ said softly. No, Daniel said. But we may be the first who had what we needed to succeed. He looked around the table. At the faces of Destiny's crew, marked by everything the journey had cost them, and at the faces of SG-1, marked by a different but equally real accounting of impossible things survived. When the Odyssey arrived, we gained something the previous crews didn't have. More minds. More technology. A different set of experiences brought from a different set of challenges. He paused. The document's threshold, the distance at which the invitation becomes active, we crossed it 6 hours ago. Which means we crossed it after the Odyssey arrived. Not a coincidence, Vala said. I don't think so, Daniel said. TEALC, who had been silent through the entire briefing with the absolute focused stillness of a warrior who understood that some battles were won by listening rather than speaking, said, the drones. Everyone looked at him. The Berserker drones, TEALC said. They attacked with greater force and greater tactical sophistication in their second engagement than their first. As though the threshold crossing prompted an escalation. He looked at Rush. Are the drones part of the test? Rush stared at him. The document mentions, he pulled it up rapidly, scanning. Here. A phrase I hadn't fully contextualized. He read it aloud in Ancient, then translated, the path is not unguarded. The Guardians do not distinguish between those who are ready and those who are not. Readiness is demonstrated by passage, not assessed before it. The drones aren't trying to stop us, Carter said slowly. They're the final exam.
Brilliant, Eli said, in the tone of someone who found something simultaneously impressive and deeply inconvenient. How many more engagements? Mitchell asked, directly and practically. Rush ran calculations with the rapid efficiency of a man who had been waiting for someone to ask the right question. Based on the drone deployment pattern, the regional density of their operational zones, and our current position relative to the signal origin, he looked up. 3 more. Possibly 4. Each one larger than the last. Mitchell looked at the Odyssey's shield status on his tablet. 28% efficiency restored in the hours since the battle. The regeneration was continuing, but the curve was not linear. The last 30% of shield regeneration took longer than the first 70, a function of Asgard shield architecture that Carter had explained once in terms he'd understood in the moment and retained as it gets harder at the end. Odyssey's shields won't be at full before the next engagement, he said. Destiny's FTL won't be at full either, Rush said. Can we modify the FTL discharge? Carter asked. What you used at the end of the last engagement, the directed discharge through the weapons array. If we can configure the Odyssey's Asgard power core to supplement the charge rate. The Asgard core is still operating at reduced capacity, Rush said. 63%, Carter said. Which is enough to supplement Destiny's FTL charge by approximately 40% if we route it correctly through the mediation architecture we built. She looked at Rush. Combined, we could reach full FTL charge in 2 hours instead of 4. And if the discharge configuration is refined. It can be refined, Rush said. He was already thinking about it, the way he thought about things. Visibly, the internal process externalizing itself in the set of his jaw and the focus of his eyes on a point slightly past the physical present. The first discharge was unrefined. Spherical. We wasted energy on vectors that didn't have drone targets. A directed discharge, shaped, using a configuration I've been working on theoretically. Could be significantly more efficient, Carter finished. They looked at each other across the table. The recognition of complementary minds finding a shared solution was visible to everyone watching, not warmth, not friendship, but something perhaps more durable. The mutual respect of two people who had each found the other genuinely difficult to exceed. We'll need time, Rush said. We have 2 hours, Young said. Use them. The thing that happened next did not announce itself. It arrived in the way that significant things in the deep universe often did, quietly, through the mechanism of a system that most of the crew wasn't monitoring at the precise moment it activated. Destiny's communication array lit up. Not the standard communication systems. Not radio, not subspace, not any of the frequencies that both crews had experience with. The array that activated had been dormant for the entire period of Destiny's crew journey. It was listed in the ship's systems as long-range signal interface, status, awaiting threshold condition. The threshold condition it had been awaiting was the one they had crossed 6 hours ago. Eli noticed it first and made a sound that brought 3 people to his console within 4 seconds. The signal coming through the array was structured. It was clearly structured, in the way that Daniel's translation of the database document had described, not structured like language, not structured like mathematics in any form that mapped to human or ancient frameworks, but structured in the way that something fundamental was structured. The way physical laws were structured, not imposed on the universe but intrinsic to it. And beneath the structure, threaded through it the way a melody was threaded through harmonics, was something that felt, to everyone in the command center who heard it through the speakers that Eli had instinctively connected it to, like an acknowledgement. Not a greeting. Not a message. An acknowledgement. Something had noticed them noticing it, across a distance that made the word vast sound like an understatement, and had registered their presence in a way that was too deliberate to be coincidence and too vast to be fully processed by minds that were, by the document's own honest accounting, not quite ready yet. But closer, perhaps, than any mind that had attempted it before. Young stood in the command center and listened to the signal. That ancient, structured, patient signal that had been broadcasting since before complex life existed, and felt the particular quality of a moment that would not come again. The moment before. The last instant of the world that had existed before the thing that was about to change it. Mitchell stood beside him. Neither spoke. The signal continued, patient and vast, from whatever waited at the end of Destiny's long and necessary road. The 2 hours that Rush and Carter had been given became 3, because the problem they were solving refused to be solved in 2, and Young made the command decision to hold position and let them finish rather than push forward underprepared. It was the kind of decision that looked like caution from the outside and felt like discipline from the inside, the practiced restraint of a commander who had learned, at significant cost, the difference between urgency and haste. The modification to the FTL discharge was not a simple engineering task. It was, as Carter described it to Mitchell during a brief corridor conversation while carrying a components case to the engineering section, more like teaching 2 instruments that had never played together to perform a piece of music that had never been written, in a concert hall that was also moving at sublight speed through an alien galaxy while something ancient and vast listened from beyond the horizon of human comprehension. Mitchell had nodded and said, "So, Tuesday," and Carter had laughed in the way she laughed when something was genuinely funny rather than politely funny, and they had both felt, briefly, the particular warmth of shared history. Of being people who came from the same impossible context, who had the same shorthand for the same category of experience, who could make the same jokes because they had survived the same kinds of things. Then she had gone back to engineering and he had gone back to the bridge, and the work continued. Rush and Carter finished with 40 minutes to spare. The modified discharge configuration was, by any technical measure, extraordinary. Carter had contributed the ASGARD power distribution architecture, the way the core managed energy routing through multiple simultaneous pathways, maintaining stability across enormous output variance. Rush had contributed his intimate understanding of Destiny's FTL drive mechanics, the precise resonance frequencies of the ship's energy matrix, and a theoretical framework he had developed over months of solitary calculation that had been waiting, without his knowing it, for exactly this application. Together they had built something that was neither ASGARD nor ancient but genuinely both. A hybrid discharge configuration that could direct the FTL energy not in a sphere but in a shaped field, a three-dimensional pattern that could be adjusted in real time to follow drone positions. It was, Rush said, reviewing the completed work with the expression of a man who rarely surprised himself and had just done so, considerably better than what he had envisioned.
Carter said nothing. She allowed herself a small, private satisfaction that she did not display, because she understood Rush well enough by now to know that the most respectful response to his acknowledgement was not to amplify it. They briefed Young and Mitchell together, which felt correct. The combined system required coordination between both ships, Destiny providing the FTL matrix, Odyssey providing the ASGARD power supplementation, the mediation architecture maintaining the link between them. If either ship broke the connection during the discharge, the configuration collapsed. The discharge failed. They would be back to the unrefined version, effective but wasteful, and in an engagement with more drones than either previous encounter. Wasteful was a problem they couldn't afford. If we break the link, Mitchell said, what happens to the Odyssey's power grid? Carter met his eyes. Managed shutdown of non-essential systems. We'd lose shields for approximately 40 seconds while the core reroutes. 40 seconds without shields in a drone engagement. Yes. Mitchell looked at the configuration diagram. Then at Young. Young looked back with the expression of a man who had made his assessment and was waiting to see if Mitchell's matched. We hold the link, Mitchell said. Whatever happens. We hold it until you fire or until there's nothing left to fire at. Agreed, Young said. The drones came 40 minutes later. 31 of them, in a formation that neither crew had seen before, not a pincer, not a dispersed screen, but a sphere. A complete enclosure, attack vectors approaching from every direction simultaneously, designed to eliminate the angular maneuvering that had allowed the Odyssey to create firing windows in the previous engagement. The sphere formation was, as Eli observed with the tone of someone who deeply wished he was wrong, the tactical response of a system that had processed 2 full engagements and concluded that conventional formation geometries were insufficient. They've been thinking about us, Eli said. The feeling's mutual, Mitchell said over the comm. The F-302s launched into the sphere's outer edge and did what they could, missile runs against the drones at the formation's perimeter, chipping at the numbers while the capital ships maneuvered inside the tightening enclosure. Reyes flew with the controlled fury of a pilot who understood that her fighters were buying time rather than winning the engagement and committed to that role completely, her 8 aircraft spreading across the formation's surface in patterns designed to force the drone's targeting allocation to its maximum complexity. 6 drones peeled from the sphere to engage the F-302s. 25 continued inward. The Odyssey fired continuously. The ASGARD plasma beams tracked across the sphere's inner surface in the rotating pulse pattern Carter had established, and drones died or damaged in every arc the beams could reach, but 25 were too many to thin fast enough, and the sphere was compressing, the drones adjusting their closing speed with the mechanical patience of systems that had no concept of being rushed. Destiny's weapons hammered the sphere from inside. Coordinated with the Odyssey's fire in the way that 2 crews who had fought together twice now coordinated, not through constant communication but through the developed intuition of units that had found each other's rhythm, covering angles the other couldn't reach, shifting fire when the other needed a window. 8 drones destroyed. 7 damaged. 16 fully functional and closing to weapons range. Rush, Young said. 90 seconds, Rush said. He was managing the FTL charge status and the mediation link to the Odyssey simultaneously, his console displaying both in a split view that he monitored with the focused intensity of a surgeon managing 2 critical systems in a single operation. The link is stable. Carter's core is holding the supplementation. 90 seconds. The first drone reached capital ship weapons range and fired. Destiny's shields took the hit and distributed it across the grid with the ship's ancient and practiced efficiency. 43% shield efficiency. The number dropped. The Odyssey took 2 hits simultaneously from opposite sides of the sphere, the geometry that the sphere formation had been designed to achieve, the attack angle that bypassed the advantage of reactive maneuvering. The ASGARD shields held both impacts and the efficiency dropped to 51%. The ASGARD core maintained the mediation link without interruption. Carter had built the link stability protocol specifically to survive exactly this kind of simultaneous load. More drones reached weapons range. The sphere tightened. 60 seconds. Mitchell flew the Odyssey in the interior of the tightening sphere with everything the ship had, using her sublight drives at 118% of rated capacity, a number that would require a maintenance report filed with people who would have strong feelings about it, to keep any single face of the sphere from achieving the targeting lock density that would saturate the ASGARD shields. He flew by feel and by the tactical display and by 43 years of developed instinct, and the Odyssey moved through the closing space like something alive rather than something piloted, her plasma beams firing into every window her angles created. The F-302s, outside the sphere, drove 3 drones away from the perimeter with a combined missile salvo that Reyes coordinated with the precise timing of a pilot who had found, in the last 10 minutes of this engagement, the particular clarity of mind that arrived when fear and function had fully integrated and left only function. 30 seconds. Destiny's shields at 31%. Odyssey's shields at 38%. 14 drones still functional inside the sphere. 3 outside engaged with the F-302s. Rush, Young said. His voice was even. Completely even. 10 seconds, Rush said. The mediation link pulsed between the ships, that improbable connection between Asgard and Ancient. Mathematics, built in 6 hours by 2 minds that had been designed by completely different experiences to arrive at this specific complementarity. The FTL charge reached threshold. The Asgard core's power supplementation held the peak stable rather than allowing it to spike and decay. Rush looked at Carter's status indicator on his console. Green. Carter looked at Rush's status indicator on hers. Green. Fire, Young said. The discharge was different from the first one in the way that a finished work was different from a rough draft, the same fundamental energy, the same source, but shaped now with intention and precision rather than released in its raw form. The field expanded from Destiny not as a sphere but as a structured pattern that moved through the drone formation like water, finding every channel simultaneously, concentrating energy at each drone's position with an efficiency that the unrefined version had never approached. It lasted 2.3 seconds. When it ended, the space around both ships was empty. Not damaged. Not retreating. Empty. The F-302s, outside the sphere's perimeter, found themselves with no targets. Reyes brought her flight around in a slow arc and looked at the space where 31 drones had been, and the transmission she sent back to the Odyssey was 3 seconds of silence followed by a single word that her flight recorder would preserve exactly as spoken. Clear. The silence after was different from the silences after the previous engagements. Those silences had carried the residue of danger still present. The knowledge that the drones had withdrawn rather than been destroyed, that the reprieve was temporary, that the test continued. This silence had a different quality. Cleaner. Resolved. The particular stillness of something completed. Destiny's sensors ran their sweeps. Eli ran them twice, then a third time with the backup array. No contacts. No approach vectors. No signatures emerging from the dust nebula's shadow. Nothing, Eli said. He looked at his display as though expecting it to contradict him. It didn't. There's nothing out there. Young looked at Rush. The document, Rush said quietly, describes a final Guardian engagement. After which, he pulled up the text. After which the path is open. In the following hour, something changed in Destiny's navigation. It was not a dramatic change. The ship did not lurch or shudder or announce itself. The navigation display simply updated. A course correction, minor in its angular adjustment but profound in what it represented, executed by Destiny's own systems without human input, as though the ship had been waiting for exactly this moment to take the final step herself. The new course led directly toward the signal's origin. Destiny had been flying this path for 3 million years. She knew the way. They gathered, both crews, in the observation dome at Destiny's stern. Not by order or announcement.
By the organic convergence of people who understood that something was happening that deserved to be witnessed together. Mitchell stood near Young. Carter stood near Rush, who stood with his arms crossed and his eyes fixed on the stars ahead with an expression that was the closest thing to peace that anyone aboard had seen on his face. Daniel stood with Vala, his hand near hers in the way of people who had decided that the space between them didn't need to be maintained. TEALC stood at the dome's edge with the stillness of a warrior at rest. Eli stood with his tablet forgotten at his side, looking at the universe with the unguarded expression of a young man from New Jersey who had followed an impossible thread to the edge of everything anyone had ever known. Destiny's crew filled the rest of the space. Scott and TJ and Greer and Chloe and the others who had survived the long journey to this moment, each carrying the specific weight of everything it had cost and the specific quality of being present for something no human being had ever been present for before. The signal was stronger here. Not louder, it wasn't a matter of volume. Clearer. More present. As though proximity had resolved something that distance had kept ambiguous, the way a face became a face rather than a shape as you approached through fog. In the stars ahead, something was visible that had not been visible before. Not a ship. Not a station. Not any structure that mapped to existing categories. A region of space where the stars themselves seemed arranged with a deliberateness that the random distribution of stellar formation could not account for, a pattern visible only at this distance, on this heading, through sensors that were reading the universe in ways that 3 million years of travel had prepared them to read. A pattern that matched, precisely and completely, a geometric sequence that appeared on the first page of the testament left in Destiny's deepest archive by whoever had traveled aboard her in her early centuries. They had left a signature. A confirmation. You are where you are meant to be. Young looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Mitchell. Mitchell looked back. No words were necessary. 2 commanding officers, 2 ships, 2 crews that had found each other at the edge of human experience and held together through every subsequent pressure, they understood each other well enough by now that the look was sufficient. Young keyed the ship-wide calm. His voice was steady and quiet and carried the weight of a man who had brought his people through the impossible and was standing on the other side of it. This is Colonel Young. All hands, we're here. Destiny had always known the way. 3 million years of travel through the deep universe, through galaxies uncounted, through the deaths of stars and the births of others, through the long patient dark between everything, and she had arrived exactly where she was sent. Her crew, stranded and struggling and magnificently, stubbornly alive, had become what the journey required them to become. And when the moment came that no previous crew had reached, the universe had sent them something unexpected, a ship from home, damaged and displaced, carrying people who had spent their lives walking through the impossible and emerging on the other side changed but unbroken. SG-1 had not meant to be here. The Odyssey had not been sent on this mission. They had arrived by accident and stayed by choice, and in staying had provided exactly what Destiny's crew needed at the precise moment they needed it, more minds, more firepower, more of the specific human quality that the Testament had called becoming. What waited ahead was beyond language. Beyond the categories any of them currently possessed. But they were, for the first time in the history of anyone who had attempted this journey, ready to find out. The Odyssey's running lights held steady alongside Destiny's in the dark, 2 ships, 1 purpose, the signals singing around them from whatever waited at the origin of everything. The path was open. They flew on. May the Force be with you. More stories await.